Happy Juneteenth. Happy Juneteenth, everybody. Let freedom ring. I've really been looking forward to this because my friend at KNCO, Tom Fitzsimmons, tells me when I talk about history, I seem to get younger. And so by the end of the evening, I'm hoping to be 50 again. But good news for the rest of you, it seems to be contagious. I was waiting in the DMV last week, and a nice woman sat down next to me and told me she had been to one of my talks about James Hague. It was at North Star House, and she said she found it so entertaining it completely took her mind off of the fact she was having surgery the next morning. And the next morning she got a new hip. It was really successful, and she is young again. So you've come to a good place. I want to talk to you tonight about James D. Hague, and he's the subject of my current book, Gold Camp Gentlemen, which, well, what do you know, is for sale here. And people call me a mining historian, and I'm grateful for that. I'm glad that they say that. I think of myself as a cultural historian. Now, our self-image often doesn't exactly align with the way other people see us. Like, in my self-image, I've got a full head of blonde hair. And I'm surprised people are not looking at me and saying, surf's up all day long. So I want to talk a little bit about cultural things in this county, and as an object of cultural history, I want to talk about this man, James D. Hague, and not really what is more obvious evidence that someone is a cultural figure than he had his portrait painted by John Singer Sargent. That's what's on the cover of this book, so beautifully designed by David Comstock, longtime officer and member of this society. And this book is David's last book. He has sold Comstock Bonanza Press to our friend Cindy Anderson, who is with us tonight. And so Comstock Bonanza Press will go on. So what I want to do is just spend a few minutes and kind of penciling in the background of James Hague's life as a miner and a mining engineer. And that's just kind of get that stuff out of the way, and then get on to the story about James Hague as a cultural figure in this region, in America, and even beyond. So James D. Hague was born in Boston in 1836. He was not part of the gold rush. When John Marshall discovered gold up south of here on the American River, James Hague was a 10-year-old boy skating on Jamaica Pond in Boston. He went to Harvard, as the Bostonians do, and only stayed there for a year, which was a good idea because Harvard was in the doldrums in that period of time. He went on and got his education in Europe, and I'll come back to that, talking about culture. And then he joined, when he got back to America, served in the US Navy during the Civil War, had a big success helping to locate and begin to develop a copper mine on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, the Calumet and Hecla, which became the largest copper mine in the world in its time. And then he took a government job and was part of the 40th parallel survey. So before there was a U.S. Geological Survey, these surveys of the American West were administered and funded by the U.S. Army. Hague became part of this survey team. He was the economic geologist on the team working under the leader whose name was Clarence King, and we'll come back to Clarence King. And Clarence King later became the first director of the U.S. Geological Survey and really set up that department of the federal government. So with that behind him, Hague became a consulting engineer, he was called, and he traveled all over the American West. He initially lived in San Francisco for about 8 years because much of his work was this side of the Rocky Mountains. Much of his work was in California. And he wrote reports for investors. And in our terms, what he really was an economic geologist. Minerals are in the ground. There's more gold in this region, for example, than was ever taken out. The question an economic geologist asks is, can you extract those minerals and make a profit doing it? And James Hague was extraordinarily skillful at answering that question. Matter of fact, as far as protecting investors' money goes, he really never got it wrong in his whole career. And he never identified a mine that ended up being a loser. Now, some of them weren't great bonanzas, but none of them lost money either. And so one of his early mining projects was hardly a stone's throw from here. And that was the Pittsburgh gold mine. And there's Pittsburgh Mine Road. If you go up Tunnel Road behind the Safeway, and I'm pointing the right way, behind the large Safeway, you go up Tunnel Road, and sort of up at the Y up there is Pittsburgh Mine Road. Mr. Hague interested British investors in that project, and it was never a huge bonanza, never compared to the Empire, the Idaho, Maryland, but it always made money too. And those British investors were involved in that project for over 50 years and eventually sold to the family that owns it now. So that was typical of James Hague's value to investors as an economic geologist. In his day, everybody was just kind of lumped together. It was before professionalization, and everyone was just called a mining engineer if they worked in mining. And so he did a lot of work, as I said, in the American West, California, Nevada, lots of work at high altitude in Colorado, Leadville, Telluride. He was middle-aged, at least, before he got involved in the North Star mine in Grass Valley. And he didn't want to get involved. William Bourne had met, young William Bourne, he was at least a dozen years younger than Mr. Hague. Young William Bourne had resuscitated the Empire Mine when eminent geologists said that it was worked out. It was too deep to be economical any longer. And he defied that advice, and he brought the Empire Mine back by drilling deeper, 1,000 feet deeper, and made it a bonanza again. And based on that success in the early 1880s, he bought the North Star Mine, which we now know is really working the same ore body, but the North Star is on the other side of Wolf Creek. And so they were entirely separate operations. And Mr. Bourne bought the North Star in order to flip it. He just wanted to get it working, get water power in there, and he literally put a fresh coat of paint on the buildings. It was green. He thought that would appeal to a buyer. And he needed a geologist to really show, to prove that the North Star was a valuable investment. Now, he had a geologist, an engineer named John Hay Hammond, who was a young man about Bourne's age. And William Bourne met James Hague in an inn down in the Motherlode country one night and recognized that Hague was just the man he needed. And so it took him some time to persuade Hague to come to work at the North Star, because Hague could foresee a triangle where Bourne had two advisors competing against one another. And he saw an unpleasant situation brewing. Finally, Mr. Bourne leaned on his subordinate, John Hay Hammond, in the way that only William Bourne could lean on people, and got him to write a letter asking James Hague to come. That seemed to tip the tide. James Hague came. The three of them worked on the North Star geology together. And it was, as James Hague feared, probably a little tense, a little turbulent. But James Hague he had the best social skills. One of the themes of this talk you'll hear over and over, lifelong friend. Any friend he made, he kept for life. He was absolutely charming. And so in the midst of this tension, which William Bourne later referred to as the power and thunder of Hague and Hammond, presumably in their arguments, Hague came up with the most wonderful expression. And so you have to know, to appreciate this, the host rock for gold ore in this region, in California, is quartz. And so the mountains up, the tectonic plates collided over near Humboldt Bay someplace. The mountains raised up, the granite intruded, the other minerals came up in the faults in the granite, the quartz came up, and in the quartz was the gold. And so you just imagine Hague trying to sort of neutralize a tense situation. And so he described the three of them, Bourne, Hague, and Hammond, as pursuing quartz by day and pints by night. And Mr. Hague became so intrigued with the geology of the North Star mine that he bought the place. And in 1887, took over ownership and began to develop it. And it took him really 12 years, because what he did was consolidate, Grass Valley, Nevada City too, but Grass Valley, just full of little mines, small operations, mining claims, fractional mining claims, all of these properties. And what James Hague recognized was to really make money at the North Star, he needed to operate at scale, at a larger scale than anybody was operating in these parts at that time. And so he had to go about trying to acquire all these nearby mines and mining claims. In the book, there's a list, a partial list, but it's a long list of different properties that he acquired. And he had to do it secretly, at least to start, because if word got out that he was buying up mines, well, the price would go up. And so he was buying some mines. William Bourne his lifelong friend, was buying some mines on his behalf. Mr. Clinch was buying some other mines on Hague's behalf. And eventually he ended up owning this mineralized region. And so, does everybody know where North Star House is? You think of where North Star House is and go almost half a mile further south, down South Auburn Road. And then from that point in the south, go north, past the fairgrounds, up Brighton Street, practically to the backyard of St. Patrick's Church. Well, that's the region he owned. Over 2 miles of property. And when he had acquired all that, then he hired his brother-in-law, Arthur D. Foote, to build a highly efficient powerhouse that converted water power into compressed air and pneumatic power, a very inexpensive source of power. And with that, he could run the mines. And then he had drilled this vertical shaft that's on the ridge just above the North Star House and goes down vertically over 1,600 feet to connect with the North Star incline shaft that started down south of the North Star House and came at an incline towards north, towards Grass Valley. And so with these 2 shafts intertwined, then he opened up that whole mineralized region for exploitation. He employed over 300 men for, I'm trying to think of exactly how long, over 60 years.
What did he pay for those mines?
What did he pay for them? Some of the figures are in the book. I would have to say as little as possible. But he did have to come to terms with these owners, one by one, coming to terms with them. And so the whole project, to assemble all this and drill the shaft, I'm not sure the figures, maybe you added up, it would be a couple of $1 million in then year dollars, when gold was $20 an ounce. Now it's $3,000 an ounce. So it was a lot of money. And so then the North Star mine became a bonanza. At the same time, James Hague had another bonanza on his hands, because as a consulting geologist engineer for investors in London, actually American investors in London, he had located a property above Telluride at about 11,000 feet in the southern Rocky Mountains, in the San Juan Mountains, and that became a bonanza too. So he became a very wealthy man. So that's the story of James Hague the miner. But I really want to get now to James Hague, the cultural figure. And so one of the ways in which he represented the best of Western culture, Western European culture, American culture. He had his education in Freiburg, Germany, at the Royal School of Mines, which is still the oldest technical university in the world. And he went there and he took so well to the curriculum and was so successful there because, first of all, he got some good chemistry background at Harvard when he was there. He went to a German university on his way to Freiburg, the University of, say it, Ilka? Göttingen. She says it right. If you really want to pursue Germanic culture, as I have been doing with James Hague, you've got to get one of these native speakers in the home. And so he went there, got a great training, especially in mathematics. And we know it was a great school for mathematics because one of James Hague's classmates was J.P. Morgan. Oh, a lifelong friend. And so he went on to Freiburg, and what seems to have propelled him to Freiburg was that he had read as a boy. His father was a Protestant clergyman, a prominent Protestant clergyman in New York and Boston and elsewhere in the East. And they had a great library at home, and his father was very interested in science. And so James Hague grew up reading stories about and hearing about Alexander von Humboldt, 1769, 1848. And von Humboldt was the world's image of what a scientist was. You know, before Hawking or Einstein or Darwin or Charles Lyell or anyone else, it was von Humboldt. He was the very model of a scientist. He was so famous around the world, Vienna chocolates had his image stamped on them. They were sold all over the world, von Humboldt chocolates. And von Humboldt was an explorer. He was a scientific explorer. And he began exploring the Alps, other regions of Europe. He got permission from the Crown in Spain to tour and do exploration work in South America and eventually in Mexico and Cuba. On his way home from his expeditions, he stopped in Washington, D.C. to talk to President Thomas Jefferson because, you know, they had some scientific stuff to talk about. And that was Hague's model of what a scientist was, an explorer in the field. And so he had opportunities later in life to become a college professor. He turned down a professorship at MIT. It was then called Boston Technical. And he did a little teaching at UC Berkeley, but not enough to keep him from being out in the field, where in his mind, where a scientist should be. He belonged to scientific academies, scientific meeting groups in London, in New York, helped to found the one in San Francisco, belonged to botanical, all his life supported botanical gardens, natural history museums, other such groups. His heirs did after him in his memory. And so he was absolutely devoted to science. And so when he went to England, when he was actually working for the Geological Survey, and he had to go call on the great British geologist and mentor of Darwin, Charles Lyell. And I don't quite know how Lyell took to him. He seemed to like him well enough. Lyell was suspicious of young men who had been to Freiburg because he had some debates with some of the Freiburg professors. But I'm pretty sure Hague negotiated that, maybe presented himself as a young man from America, not from Freiburg. But Mrs. Lyell clearly took a shine to him. Lady Lyell took a shine to him. And she arranged for him to she put on a luncheon so he could meet Darwin. And he later had lunch with Darwin at the Darwin family home in London. And then researching the book, this was one of the really fun parts. So Ilka and I, we had to go to Kent, England, because there's a village in Kent called Down, and there's a house kind of aristocratic country house called Down House. Well, that was Darwin's house. And Darwin not only was a great scientist, he was, but you go to Down House and you realize this man really had taste. It's a beautiful place. He had the help of an architect both times, but he remodeled the house twice to make it larger. And we had to go there because James Hague slept there. And so it wasn't identified, but I presume we saw the room where James Hague slept because we saw all the rooms. And it's a really wonderful display, part of the English Heritage Trust. And so Hague wrote some scientific articles. And he wrote one about ants for Nature, the scientific magazine, which is still, I hear it quoted all the time on the mainstream news reports. And Hague wrote an article about Nature, about ants for Nature, ants invading his flat in San Francisco. And he sent it to Darwin initially. Darwin sent it to Nature. And if you go to Darwin's house, really neat part are the greenhouses out and back, which have a brick foundation and partial wall and brick, and then windows above. And Darwin had this big glass tube coming in from the side of the greenhouse right into the center, and a big glass dome in which bees built a beehive. And Darwin's bees, they're still there. They're still in the hive, the descendants of Darwin's bees. And so Darwin was really troubled, and he wanted to keep on and see what the bees were up to. And he was troubled by ants too, because these critters, insects, that seemed to live this communal life and would sacrifice themselves for the community or for the colony, that seemed like it's something that could disrupt all his theories. And so Hague wrote an article about ants and actually sent it to Darwin. Darwin sent it to Nature and said, you really ought to publish this. And so that's some about James Hague, the scientist. But he was always out in the field, always exploring, if not above ground, then underground. Because to him, and really to his generation, that's what a scientist was. Now, James Hague was also a literary man. And he wrote articles and books for publication all his life. And there was a famous American author in the late 19th century, Edward Everett Hale. And he was a lifelong friend. And he told James Hague, why do you do all this traveling? You could make your living as an author. And so James Hague wrote for all of the big magazines, Overland Monthly, The Century, North American Review, National Geographic, and others. And he wrote travel articles. He wrote articles about meeting famous people such as Darwin and Thomas Carlyle, the great Scottish man of letters and historian and poet. And these articles were lapped up by the magazines. He also wrote 3 books. One of them, well, 2 of them, were pretty technical, and they're about mining. One was the book that he wrote for the 40th Parallel Survey called Mining Industry. And it is still the key reference book on the history of Virginia City, Nevada. And if you read any documented work about Virginia City in the bibliography, you will see James Hague's book listed there. And it was a wider scope than that. He wrote about a lot of mining regions, especially in Nevada and Idaho. The 40th parallel was surveying roughly the path of the Transcontinental Railroad. And the survey was done as the railroad was being completed and opened. It was commissioned by Congress. It ended up being 7 volumes with this huge atlas. This was a breakthrough thing in itself. It changed cartology. But Hague wrote volume number 3, which was economic geology. But it was published first because Clarence King, running the expedition, knew that what the people, the men in Congress who put up the money, what they wanted to know was where was the return on their investment, not only for the survey, but for the whole darn railroad. And so that's what volume 3 of the 40th parallel survey is about. And the other volumes were more pure science, flora, fauna, and so forth. He wrote another volume. Actually, it was commissioned by the State Department. He wrote it in Paris about global mining, and that became a textbook in mining schools in America for 50 years. He wrote a book at the end of his life I'll come to later. So he knew literary people too. When he first came, well, it wasn't his first time, but when he came to San Francisco to report for duty with the 40th Parallel Survey, he went to the U.S. Mint because there was a man running the mint there who was a friend of James Hague's father. And he never missed an opportunity to maintain friendships and social connections. And so he went to the Mint, he met the director, and then the director had this very interesting, handsome young man who was exactly Hague's contemporary, and his name was Bret Harte. And so Hague always had a story ready, always had a funny story at hand. And so he started telling them the story about being on a train in the Civil War, a troop train, and it was a civilian train, but the Army loaded all these soldiers on it, and there was this crying baby, and everybody was in agony, suffering. They were all tired and uncomfortable, and this crying baby. And so this gruff old soldier looked like the most unlikely candidate on the train, goes up to the young mother and asks if he can hold the baby. And so he takes the baby in his arms. He starts rocking back and forth and singing a lullaby full of profanity. Well, the director of the Mint found the story really funny. Oh, that's great, Jim. Yeah. Bret Harte was absolutely fascinated. Asked James Hague to tell it again, took notes, then asked him questions about it. 2 years later, Bret Harte and some companions like Samuel Clemens started the Overland Monthly. And in the first issue was a story that I'll bet just about everybody here read in high school, The Luck of Roaring Camp.
Oh, yes.
And if you remember the, I think, really memorable character in that story is a character called Kentuck, Old Kentuck. And he's the one who takes the little baby they call the Luck and rocks him in his arms and sings a profanity-laced lullaby. And then at the end of the story, it's old Kentuck who is found dead, clutching the dead baby in his arms. So James Hague saw Bret Harte a couple of times after he met him at the Mint, saw him at the Pacific Union Club, but the story hadn't been published. And he never saw him after James Hague read the story. And so never had the chance to ask him, hey, dude, was that my story? And they had a lot of friends in common, including Clarence King and Henry James and Henry Adams and lots of other literary types. But that was part of James Hague's literary life. And his sister-in-law was Mary Halleck Foote. And she was an illustrator, of course, and then doing some writing about the West for especially Century magazines and for some children's magazine. And she, after living in Leadville for a couple of summers, decided to turn her hand to fiction and wrote her first novel, which may have been her most popular, called The Lead Horse Claim. And she was encouraged by James Hague. He read the manuscript. He loved it. I think he had a role in helping her choose the title. And at the same time that she was writing fiction, they're talking about fiction. I presume she read some of the novel to him, one thing or another. He wrote a piece of fiction for Century, a piece called The Silk Dress Story. And it's still, and I'm not going to tell you the story, it's about misunderstanding when women, especially in Boston, they have a friend in Paris, they write to her and said, please bring me back something that's only available in Paris in the sort of the silk dress. And then inevitably things go wrong. And the silk dress gets lost or never arrives or whatever. And the silk dress story has a lot of funny lines in it. And one is, the true Bostonian is one who, when in Rome, does as the Bostonians do. At the end of his life, with friends from the Century Club, including the former Secretary of State and Secretary to President Lincoln, John Hay, and some other people I've mentioned, wrote a tribute volume to Clarence King. And it's called the Helmet of Membrano. We have Membrano China at home. Membrano was Don Quixote's helmet. And it's really, Hague wrote the most important parts of it. And it's really an elegy to the men like Clarence King, like Hague, their contemporaries, who grew up in the Gilded Age, and an age like ours that was characterized by a certain group of Americans just making a whole lot of money, and others not making that much money, and the wide disparity between them. And it's a volume of regret that scientific image that Hague had of what a scientist was, Clarence King had it too, they all had it in that generation. And they compromised it to get rich. And so there's an element of elegy in that novel to lost hopes of youth. But it's not a novel, it's a collection of essays. But in that book, to lost ideals of youth. And then it's done with just such good humor and such charm. It's wonderful book and a wonderful memory of what it was like to be alive in that age. So let's just see where we are here. Okay. You can see me better from here, sweetie? Okay. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Of everyone I want to please in the audience tonight, I mean, she's right down there.
Oh, you were starting so close.
So, James Hague was part of this group that when she came west in the 1870s, 1876, I believe, Mary Halleck Foote identified as professional exiles. And when she arrived in San Francisco, now, if you were in San Francisco anytime recently, last summer, any summer, and you see all the tourists, and they've all bought the San Francisco sweatshirt because they had no idea that San Francisco was going to be so cold. You know, the coldest winter I ever spent was summer in San Francisco. And, well, Mary Halleck Foote came overland, across the prairies and the plains, across the basin and range. It was hot all the way, and she got to San Francisco without even a sweater on. And the first person she met beside her husband was James D. Hague. And the first thing he did was give her his coat. And she said ever after, she was basking in the warmth of James D. Hague. And she called Hague and his social group in San Francisco professional exiles. And they were all highly cultured people. And so they included William and Emily Ashburner. And William had graduated from the School of Mines, not in Freiburg, but in Paris, which was, second best. And Mary Halleck Foote identified Emily Ashburner as a perfect, her idea of a perfect English lady. And then there were the Jardine brothers, Henry and Lewis's wife, and they had been classmates of Hague in Freiburg, and actually had the flat next to his flat in the rooming house in Freiburg. And there were others around them, people like the president of UC Berkeley and the dean of the School of Mines and so forth, all very cultured people. And Mary Halleck Foote said they were cosmopolitans, and they could have fit in any place. In San Francisco, or New York, or London, or Paris, or Rome, or Leadville, or Telluride, or any place else. That's the kind of cultured people they were. And they were all interested in architecture. And James Hague had a really keen interest in architecture, especially church architecture, and he liked to visit churches to see the designs, and to see the decorations and the beauty of them. For example, when Trinity Episcopal Church on Gough Street in San Francisco was almost finished, the architect gave James Hague a private tour, showed off his work, showed him what he had done. So when he needed a power plant, he had the plan a number of years before he revealed it, first of all to his brother-in-law, and then later to his investors. But he had the plan that Arthur Foote took a sketch and a narrative description and turned it into that beautiful structure that was in its day an absolute engineering marvel. And if you haven't been there, go see it. It's an engineering marvel to this day. And of course, the 30 foot, 30 and a half foot Pelton wheel is in there, and they'll run it for you. And you can watch that thing spin. And that's one of the landmarks of this region. And then the other landmark that he was behind was the North Star House. And so James Hague, he saw before his investors, before anyone else, this was in 1903, he saw the North Star mine was becoming a bonanza. And what he recognized was, the mine had made money, kind of limping along, invested, most of the money they made got invested back in buying these properties and building powerhouses and so forth. But he saw in 1903 that the mine was not just making a profit, but making the kind of profit that was going to endure for years and years. That it was making it on the basis of exploiting this huge mineralized zone that, that James Hague had accumulated. And so he came out, he would spend months at a time at Grass Valley every year. His permanent home was in New York City, which is where most of his investors were. And he would spend months at a time, and he came out one spring with just a bee in his bonnet, and he went up on the slope. The Foote family lived in the North Star cottage, and he went up on the slope above the cottage and found the spot and said, "This is where we're going to build the house." And he got Arthur and showed him the spot, and then he and Arthur got Mary Helen Foote and showed her the spot. This is the spot for the house. And then he went down to Berkeley. And what's going on the Berkeley campus? This is now the spring of 1904. This huge building project, the Berkeley campus we know today, was just starting to be built out after an international competition. And Mr. Hague goes to the Berkeley campus, and his friend, the Dean of Mines, Dean Christie, takes him, they have lunch, faculty club, one thing. I wonder what the faculty club looked like then. But anyway, and walked over to see, especially the new building, the Hearst School of Mines, which, for my money, is the most beautiful building on campus. And one of the people, the person who was finally responsible for design there under John Galen Howard, the architect of the Berkeley campus. His monuments surround you, a sign says when you're on the campus. Julia Morgan was very much involved with that building and working with Dean Christie. Maybe that's where James Hague met her, not sure. She wasn't licensed to be an architect, which is part of the reason she was working under Mr. Howard at that point in time. And the house project stalled. Now, this is a circumstantial case, so it's not in the book, it's speculative. But my speculation is James Hague held up the commission building that house, hiring an architect, until Julia Morgan had her license, which was early in 1904. Okay, so I've got my dates a little mixed. He was on the campus in 1903. She got her license and started to work on North Star House late summer, maybe summer 1904. It began to be built at the end of 1904, was completed in 1905. The Foote family had Thanksgiving dinner in North Star House. So his interest and commitment to architecture is just another piece of the cultural figure that he was and the great culture that he brought to this region. So you look at this region today and look up and down Highway 49. There's no place like this. There's no Grass Valley, Nevada City, anyplace else. I love Jackson, Amador City. I love Tuolumne County, but there's no place like this for the culture here. And so if you ask people, and I do all the time, if you talk to me afterwards, I could ask you, what brought you here? And people always say variations, and sometimes exact words, the same three things. Natural beauty, outdoor recreation, and interesting history. And, well, those all go back to the geology. You know, it's all about the rocks, people. I mean, they're going to, what is this history about? It's about the rocks. It all goes back to the geology. It all goes back to that uplift, that granite intrusion, all of that. That made for the outdoor beauty, that made for the wonderful climate, that made for the recreational opportunity. And it brought, because these two mining districts, the Grass Valley District and the Nevada City districts, which are not the same dimension, not identical with the city limits. Mining districts are their own category of things. But these two mining districts were the richest gold mining districts in all of California. And then they were supplying, especially Nevada City, supplying the rich mining districts of Sierra County and the rest of the northern Sierra. And so the most sophisticated people were attracted here because the gold was in the ground. And then they left their impression. And some people left it humbly, like the Cornish miners with their folk music and the Christmas carols, which we still sing. And some people left it on a grand scale, especially in the architecture, which is where the history of these two towns and the region is most evident and apparent. The gold rush architecture of Main Street in Grass Valley, Nevada Theater, and a building like a Carpenter Gothic building like Emmanuel Episcopal Church, which is very much a gold rush style, and the Victorian houses, the double-parlored Queen Anne houses. These were built by sophisticated, cultured people who made their money predominantly in gold mining or in supplying gold miners, like, say, the Clinches. And on that cultural foundation, the communities continued to build. So in a whole later generation, after any of these figures I talked about tonight were gone, you still have these cultural monuments like the Oro Theater or the Grass Valley United Methodist Church in its mission style. And so the culture built upon that foundation and that infrastructure that was started by very cultured people like William and Agnes Bourne, Arthur and Mary Halleck Foote, and James D. Hague, and others too. Let's not forget Sarah Kidder, who was a really sophisticated gal, very capable, and had so much to do with the look and the structure of downtown Grass Valley And even to this day, her influence is apparent to those with eyes to see. So these are some of them. There's a whole lot more, are the culture people who created this wonderful place in which we live, this really unique place in California, but among mining camps like no other two mining camps in the American West. And it's because the rocks, the gold, the culture people came. And I tried to tell tonight a bit of their story. I'm so grateful to you all for coming out. Thank you. Descendants of the Foote family here. Jennifer, Catherine? Oh, KNCO has to take it back. I promised Foote's tonight. We had Hague's at the last event. I was hoping for Foote's tonight, but we will get them out next time. Thanks so much for coming, everybody.